Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the massive general strike that literally brought the entire state of Minnesota to a grinding halt. So picture this. It's January 23rd, 2026. It is freezing. We're talking sub-zero temperatures. And yet, tens of thousands of people are out in the streets all across Minnesota. They called it an economic blackout, and that's exactly what it was, a coordinated effort to shut down the state's economy. And look, this was not just another protest. Not by a long shot. We are talking about a full-blown, statewide general strike. I mean, hundreds of businesses, everything from little local shops to major community organizations, they all closed their doors. They were standing in solidarity. So the big question is, right, what could cause something that massive to happen? Well, to really get a handle on this, we've got to rewind the clock just a little bit, back to January 7th of that year. Because it all started with one single fatal incident. And that one event, it was the spark that lit the fuse for the whole state. And that event was the killing of Renee Good. She was a 37-year-old American citizen, and she was shot and killed by an ICE agent, Jonathan Ross. Her death was the catalyst, no doubt about it. And right away, I mean immediately, two completely different stories started popping up about what went down. So you had these two totally conflicting accounts, right? The official federal story was that Agent Ross acted in self-defense, claiming that Renee Good had actually hit him with her car. But then you have the eyewitnesses and video footage, and they suggested that her car was actually turning away from the agent when he opened fire. It's this huge disagreement over the basic facts that just poured gasoline on the fire of public outrage. The reaction from local leadership, it was fast and it was loud. You had both the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, and the governor, Tim Walz, coming out and publicly demanding that ICE pull all of its agents out of the city. I mean, that is a major challenge to the federal government. But here's the thing. The killing of Renee Good didn't just happen out of nowhere. It really was like throwing a lit match into a tinderbox, because the state of Minnesota was already, just simmering with all these tensions. And you have to remember the context here. The state had been through some serious trauma. Back in 2020, you had the murder of George Floyd, which led to massive protests and civil unrest. Then, just the year before this, in 2025, there was a terrible mass shooting at a church, investigated as a hate crime. So, with this history of high-profile deaths and a real breakdown of trust with law enforcement, when the news about Renee Good hit, the public outrage just exploded. A huge part of that simmering tension was this federal program called Operation Metro Surge. Basically, it was a Trump administration initiative that flooded the state with thousands of extra federal agents, especially from ICE, to really ramp up immigration enforcement. And as you can probably guess, it was getting a ton of pushback from local leaders. Okay, so that's the backdrop. Let's get back to the strike itself. The organizers gave it a really powerful name, the Day of Truth and Freedom. And it wasn't just a name. It was a day of action that came with a list of very specific demands. And what were they asking for? Well, their goals were super clear. First, they wanted all ICE operations in Minnesota shut down immediately. And they wanted Agent Jonathan Ross arrested. But they were also thinking bigger picture, They were calling for the defunding of ICE altogether and for investigations into what they called human rights violations. So, as you can probably imagine, this whole situation drew a huge line in the sand. It created this really dramatic political standoff between the folks in Minnesota and the federal government back in D.C. And you can really see the clash right here. On one side, you've got local leaders like Mayor Frey and Governor Walz saying ICE's actions were destabilizing the community, calling it federal overreach. But on the other side, the federal government, with officials like Vice President J.D. Vance, were saying, nope, this is about law and order. They actually blamed all the chaos on local leaders for not cooperating. This conflict just kept getting more and more intense. And pretty soon, it blew up into this fiery national debate. And that's when protesters and even some members of Congress started making a very controversial historical comparison. You had lawmakers like Representative Jim McGovern coming out and drawing a direct line between ICE and the Gestapo, Nazi Germany's infamous secret police. Now, this is a comparison that for a long, long time was basically a taboo in American politics. And now, all of a sudden, it was front and center. Of course, the administration and its supporters fired right back. They totally rejected that comparison. The White House called the language unhinged, and basically accused their critics of stirring up hatred against law enforcement agents who were just, in their view, doing their jobs.
And this is where the public conversation got a little more specific. The debate started to shift to, okay, if we're going to make a historical parallel, what's the right one? Was ICE acting like the Gestapo, which was an official secret police force of the state? Or was it more like the Brown Shirts, the Nazi Party's paramilitary group, the guys enforcing things on the street level?
And that brings us to a really interesting final thought from a historian who was watching all of this unfold. The question they posed was this: is the comparison meant to be taken literally, like a direct, one-to-one historical match? Or is it actually something else? Is it a way of expressing a very modern anxiety, a deep, profound fear that the U.S. is drifting towards authoritarianism? And that question really gets to the heart of why this whole thing in Minnesota echoed so powerfully across the entire country.